I'm excited to be joined by the former spokesman and senior advisor for the National Republican Senatorial Committee, because obviously we talk a lot about the Senate, and GOP strategist Matt Whitlock. Matt, good Sunday morning. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Love all the work you're doing, and great to get to talk to you about some of these things.
You bet. I talked about the speech a minute ago. And so let me ask you, as a guy that was, look, the Save America Act is bottled up in the Senate, okay? So let's just start with that. In the sense that, do you think that the speech moved the needle forward when it comes to getting the Senate to do anything?
I definitely don't think it moved the needle backwards. I think it's helpful for the president to bring into this the other elements that are threatening our election integrity and election security. The China element is very real, and it's very scary. And I think that up to this point, some people have been able to kind of dismiss the SAVE Act as the president sort of being a conspiracy theorist, but bringing in these external elements that experts have warned about for years and years and highlighting the scale of it, I think is really valuable. Now, the SAVE Act, it's a challenge because there's parts of the SAVE Act that everyone agrees with, but there's also some parts that are a little bit sticky in some states, things like Washington sort of setting the terms for things like mail-in ballots. You know, a lot of Republicans have questions about mail-in ballots, but before 2020, Republicans dominated with mail-in ballots. And so there's things that we still need to kind of fix.
But Matt, just for the audience to get this, like I think one of the things that I just want to make sure you and I are on the same page on this, or I mean, just in terms of how we're talking about this. Sometimes people say mail-in ballots and it's a catch-all. Like I believe I vote absentee a lot. Which I'm fine with. You request a ballot, you're proven as a voter, they send you a ballot. That's very different than when we send everyone in the world a ballot and
100%.
hope that they return it.
And I think that there could be very good national federal standards for that principle. I think that would make a lot of sense. And between the two different SAVE Act versions, I think there's things that people feel like are very doable there, even from the federal level. And then I think there's some sort of what some would describe as overreaching elements to it that would really limit any of that mail absentee voting that happens in some states. And that's been
why not just strip it down? Why don't we just strip it down and say, okay, here's what we can get done. We can get proof of voter ID and citizenship. Like I guess I'm with you on mail-in ballot. Like I think this is insane. The idea that everybody gets a ballot and we hope that we know what they're really doing. So let's stop kidding ourselves. But can't we just say, hey, there should be widespread agreement on voter ID?
I think absolutely. I think they absolutely could be able to come to the same place on that. And that's one thing that I know, at least in the Senate leadership, they're trying to figure out if there's some angle to get that in and done, because as you said, and as the president constantly says, that's a 90-10 issue. And it's a sort of 85-15 issue, even among, Democrat constituencies like black voters, Hispanic voters, things like that. So that should be, to me, I think it does show why people are so frustrated with the system. When you've got something that's a 90-10 issue that we can't seem to break through. Now, Democrats have thrown every procedural hurdle they can against even the most basic forms of voter ID. We've seen Republicans try and do standalone voter ID amendments, voter ID proposals. The Democrats block every step of the way, and we know why they do that. But I hope our leaders can get creative in trying to find new pathways to try and get that through, because it would go a long way to deal with exactly what the president laid out last night.
It's funny. I hear some of these people say, oh, well, we don't want to make the Senate take tough votes. I'm like, what's tough about a 90-10 issue? What's tough about voter ID? That's insane. And yet
totally
they get away
agree
with saying, right. The funny part about this is, though, that they kept talking about the process. And I know this is a bit wonky, but the reality is you may not be able to get 100% of the SAVE Act through reconciliation because the parliamentarian is going to rule that there has to be a budgetary impact. But I think there's parts of it, and that's where I feel like people are fatalistic and give up too soon. Instead of saying, okay, look, we're not going to get 100% because of whatever, but we can get 60 through reconciliation. Let's try.
100%. And I do think there have been some creative approaches to even try and make voter ID a budgetary element. Things like giving more funding to election administration. That's a budget line right there that could be used to enforce voter ID. So we've seen some creative approaches. It's just landing the plane, and it's very frustrating to anybody watching Washington and seeing, wait, like you can't even do these most basic things. So I understand why Congress, why Washington in general just has an all-time low approval rating. That's very frustrating, and it would go such a long way to secure our elections, to be able to do some of those very basic things that everyone actually likes.
So aside from the Save Act aspect of it, there was a lot of talk in the president's speech about China in particular and others interfering with our election, which, oh, by the way, Joe Biden had done. But Margaret Brennan, I know you pointed this out on X, gave voice to, she took the side of them. Let me play this for everyone so we understand what we're talking about.
It's impossible for us to fact check each thing that was said, but on the specific thing in regard to China that you raised, the president was informed when he was president in his first term in a classified memo on January 7th, both the assessments regarding interference, and that was also public prior to that date. So he was aware, and we reported on this network at the time in regard to the assessments as to which foreign countries favored which election candidates. He seems to be alleging there that China actively tried to undermine him and even referenced wanted to get him to resign at one point. Ahead of this, I did reach out to Chinese officials who were already prepared with a pre-buttal here. I'll read it to you. The quote is, China has long adhered to the principle of non-interference in others' internal affairs. The U.S. election is an internal matter, its outcome determined by the American people. China never and will never interfere in the presidential elections of the United States. Now, what was assessed by the intelligence community and made public as recently as I'm looking at April 2020. I want to read for you what was in the National Intelligence Council. It said Chinese intelligence officials analyzed multiple states' election voter registration data to conduct public opinion analysis on the 2020 U.S. general election. So public opinion analysis is what the U.S. intelligence community said the Chinese were doing. The president is alleging something far more aggressive there in actively undermining his presidency. And I think, Tony, the question for tomorrow will continue to be, and so what are you going to do about it?
So, Matt, in other words, these aren't the droids you're looking for. I mean, I felt like I don't know why this was even controversial. She's kind of like, I want to read you the Chinese talking points, which I was a little taken back by.
Yeah, I mean, well, if the Chinese Communist Party says it, I guess we should just trust it, right, Margaret? I mean,
hell.
the Democracy Dies in Darkness media is perfectly happy to take up the word of the worst, biggest liars and propagandists in probably the history of civilization if it means they can dunk on the president. And the other point that she raised there was, I think she said either an April or May intelligence assessment from 2020 saying that they were only looking at public opinion, but like that's not even really engaging with what the president was talking about. The voter file and public opinion are very different there. And just because the Chinese said that they only did, public opinion surveys, like that's ridiculous. There's no reason to take their word over what the president laid out. And also, I think that to me, it just shows they're so eager to try and discredit the president that they don't even engage with the substance of what he's talking about. They would rather sort of use Chinese propaganda to kind of, just dismiss everything that he's saying, and they kind of straw man it a little bit by dismissing a totally different thing than the president was even talking about. And I just think it does America such a huge disservice. But if you watch Margaret Brennan, man, she has had a rough year. I feel like all the way back to the JD interview. Remember JD with, I don't really care, Margaret? There's been so many of those where she goes into big interviews just not prepared. And that's what this coverage last night felt like. CBS made such a big point of trying to not show certain things and try and do everything they can to fact check. But it's not fact checking if you are using the CCP, Chinese Communist Party messaging as your baseline for what facts are.
You know why I think she did this, though? So NBC, ABC did not cover it, right? I think that what happened is the folks at CBS said, okay, if we're going to be the ones that have to cover it, we've got to look like we didn't want to do it. And so that's why Margaret Brennan and others at CBS went above and beyond, because they needed to basically show to their woke, colleagues.
That's exactly right.
Look, I want to get into the Senate. I want to get into the Senate stuff, but I wanted to ask you as a fellow comms guy, here's the point. I tweeted this out, and obviously a lot of people agreed with me because of the number of retweets. But the president has sort of alleged that NBC and ABC have by not covering, committed fraud. Leave that aside for a second. I'm not. That's a legal question for Brendan Carr and at the FCC or whatever. But there's no question fundamentally that they occupy the public airways. CNN and Fox and MSN now or whatever are in cable. When you occupy the public airways, you have a fiduciary duty to serve the public interest, right? Okay.
Yep.
I would believe, and someone last night was like, what do you think about Biden? I think they should have covered Biden. I just do, right? Who cares? Why are you hiding the president of the United States? I want more people to see Biden and Obama. I wanted them to see how crazy their policies were. So I'm fine with that, by the way. But here's my proposition that I put out last night. If you don't want to cover the president, okay, fine. Okay, you don't have to cover him. But then don't expect to get called on in a White House briefing. Why is it that they don't want to cover the president, but they want to ask a staffer a question? And my answer was, so Caroline should not call on NBC and ABC.
And I think Caroline would be happy to oblige on that.
You do?
I think Caroline would be happy to not call on them to make the point that you're making. And I think tactically that's a really, really smart thing to do. If you don't want to cover the president, then that should extend to access to the briefing room where you get to ask important questions. It shouldn't all be on the media
so look, just to be clear,
terms.
I think, look, they want to get access to the briefing room and go into it, sure, but don't reward them. Don't give them the question. And I brought this up earlier, but I mean, my whole point is, like, I'm not trying to strip them of their First Amendment right to go cover stuff.
Sure.
Go for it. But do not reward them. Don't give them, questions.
I think that's really smart. Right. And I also just think generally the ABC, the whole broadcast license thing, these are the people that think The View should be counted as the same kind of straight news as your evening news broadcast. And it is the biggest pipeline of misinformation I have ever seen in political media. And so, again, this is a much larger conversation. As you said, Brendan Clark can get into it, but these are not good faith actors.
Well, I just want people in the audience to understand what Matt just said. So if you are a regular show, you're supposed to have equal time. What ABC has argued to the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, is they've said The View is a bona fide news program along the lines of Meet the Press and Nightly News, and that would therefore exempt them from having, presenting both sides on air. So in other words, they're claiming, not anyone else, not Sean Spicer, not Matt Whitlock, but ABC is claiming that The View is a bona fide news program along the lines of other news programs. And I'm like, that to me, okay, I get a kick out of that. But Matt, your background is in the Senate, really. I do want to start first and foremost with obviously the loss of Senator Graham, but more specifically, some of the outrageous and inappropriate responses by some of the Dems. And I know you tweeted out, one of these folks sent a cake to his office about him dying.
Yep. Yeah, this is really horrific stuff. And to me, it's kind of tragic. As somebody who kind of grew up in the political scene around September 11th and saw how tragedy could unite people of sort of different views, what we've sort of pivoted to in the last probably 5-6 years, in part due to social media and the desire to show hatred for clicks and things like that. But what Sean's talking about is a woman, a lunatic activist lady who didn't just send it. She personally dropped off a cake to Graham's office where his younger sister is now occupying it with staff, saying, congratulations, your brother is burning in hell and now you're working for the devil. I just think this is another example of the political mental health crisis. And I think that we've seen it for a long time. Secretary Rubio gave a phenomenal speech this week on the rise of sort of leftist, liberal-driven violence. And I think that we've excused this for such a long time because half the media, half the country is, willing to justify a certain level of political violence if they hate people enough. We've seen polling that's shown this. But, how many steps is it from I'm willing to celebrate a guy's death and take a cake all the way to his office to talk about how happy I am that he died, to actually carrying out violence and supporting violence? And when you see all the polling, Gallup and a bunch of other really reputable pollsters have found that people on the left are comfortable with political violence to achieve their policy goals. This is scary stuff. And again, it's horrible that sometimes it's a tragedy like a death of Lindsey Graham, who actually was very loved by his Democrat colleagues across the board. He's the kind of guy most Democrats should hope for from Republicans because he always made deals. And Republicans were constantly frustrated with him for some of the things that he tried to sort of come to the table with Democrats on. And yet they are treating him like a Nazi demon. And that just shows where the left is today.
To be honest, something that you said was so poignant. I always laugh at. I live not far from a Tesla dealership, and I drive on these beautiful Saturday mornings, and I see 20, 40, 50 people out in front of a Tesla dealership with signs, and I was like, "Do you not have anything better to do on a Saturday?" Like I have a million things I could be doing, and then
I think about that every time.
But stop and think about what Matt just said. Right? You bought a cake. You had to have it. It's got Senator Graham's, and Matt's got it up on his X feed, but like it's got his face on it. Like it took some time to do all this, to go out and decorate and whatever you sent to the grocery store or whatever. But like they had to take time to do this. Then they picked it up. Then they went to the Senate. I think she doesn't live in the area. I mean, like that takes a lot of time to be like, wow, I want to be a jerk. Like a lot of time. Yep. And I'm just amazed by this folks on the left. But let me kind of go into Maine. I've been concerned about the race in Maine since Plattner dropped out, because I do think that a generic Democrat, like that doesn't have Nazi tattoos, could actually present a threat to Susan Collins. And then I watched the debate.
Oh, man.
And, oh, my gosh, let me play people the clip, because this is one of the candidates that's running to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. Take a listen to this person. Her name is Ashley Webb, responding to why she is, fit to serve the people of Maine.
Ashley Webb, what qualifications do you have to serve in the U.S. Senate?
Oh, I ran for office several times. Didn't win, but I did run. And then I'm a songwriter, and then I write my own books. And then I suppose my transparency, I wouldn't lie to the people, and I wouldn't deceive the people like we're being deceived right now. Like
Matt, that's going to be tough if we end up with Ashley Webb. I mean, she writes her own songs and her books. I was like, well, hope we don't end up with Ashley Webb. I mean,
watch out, Marco and JD in 28.
Yeah, I mean, hey, this is. I was like, oh my God, I couldn't imagine being on stage and being that person. Where is Maine on your radar when it comes to level of concern going into the midterms?
Well, I think you always should be concerned because it's a state with a cheaper media market where Democrats, if they wanted to, could swamp even a less impressive candidate. However, to your point, I think watching that debate last night, I think a lot of people are thinking, are Democrats really even going to challenge here? Are Democrats really even going to try? Because now, just to paint the picture for anyone who's just listening to this, Ashley, who that audio played, is a 6'5", recently transitioned transgender activist. And her quotes throughout were phenomenal. She talks about how she just wants to go to the bathroom and not get attacked. She wants to deal with what she called pork belly, which I think she meant like pork barrel, all the different pork spending in Washington. But she wasn't even like the worst on policy messaging. When you look at the best candidates they had there, I'd say the people Democrats feel most confident in are Troy Jackson and Shenna Bellows, both of whom just got rocked in the Democrat gubernatorial primary and now are supposed to be the ones who can take on electoral juggernaut Susan Collins. So for me, never take it for granted. You still have to work every day, but these are not serious people, and Democrats do not have any kind of A-team white knight. And so seriously, not just saying this as a Republican operative, there have to be conversations going on between Chuck Schumer, his super PAC, Senate Majority PAC, that spent, I believe, $100 million in 2020 on what they thought and was a good generic Democrat in Sarah Gideon. They have to be thinking, we need to save money for other places, especially because Michigan is looking like a hot mess for them, and New Hampshire is looking like a very sneaky pickup opportunity for Republicans. Why spend $100 million promoting trans activist Ashley and her book writing when you need to save, and kind of batten down the hatches in a few other states?
All right, I just want to get, you mentioned there's 3 races that Democrats, of the 9 that are pretty much considered contested, I would argue it's probably 8 now. Democrats have 3 that Republicans are trying to go after. The seat that John Ossoff has, the Democrat there in Georgia, the open seat that is available in New Hampshire, which will likely be former Senator John Sununu versus Congressman Chris Pappas. And then in Michigan, where you've got another Dem retiring, and you've either got El Said or Ashley Stevens versus Mike Rogers. If you had to rank those three, give me the rank real quick. What in terms of the likelihood for pickup?
I think Michigan is most likely pickup. Mike Rogers came 19,000 votes away from beating a much better candidate just 2 years ago, who outspent him 5-1. Haley Stevens is getting the sort of Biden pickup of, Jim Clyburn coming in to try and rally black voters behind her to save her from a radical. But progressives are not going to buy that. And I think they're going to stay home. I think Michigan is looking actually pretty good for us. My number 2 in that ranking would probably be New Hampshire, just because we have a candidate that has great name ID, who I think is a sneaky good, moderate sort of pickup opportunity. And he's running a really solid campaign that Democrats are getting nervous about and starting to reserve more ad space in. Georgia's just tough because even though John Ossoff is not very impressive, all he needs to do is just run attack ads, and he's raised so much money. I think that it actually is a little bit closer than people are expecting, and I think that the Ossoff strategy of focusing on Jeffrey Epstein, to me, feels like kind of a weird mistake because it's very DC focused, and Mike Collins can really focus on, affordability and concerns that people on the ground have. So I don't think that Georgia is at all off the map, but I do think that Michigan presents our best option of those three.
All right. Matt Whitlock, thanks for joining us, breaking it all down. Appreciate your insights. We'll have you back soon to get a further analysis of the Senate.